Good evening, all. How are you? Good to see you all as we gather this evening. A little bit different this evening than normal for our evening service, as we have a presentation from these two fine gentlemen, which you'll meet in a moment. But before we do that, let me read to you briefly from Psalm 104. I'll open this in prayer, and then I'm going to get out of the way. I'm going to turn this over to our own Dr. Jack Collins and Dr. Ross as well from Liberty University, and they'll give fuller introductions here in just a moment. Listen to the words of Psalm 104. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes his messengers winds, his ministers a flaming fire. Let me open us with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your greatness demonstrated to us in many ways, but throughout the creation, for sure. We are grateful for the way that you have left your fingerprints all over all that you have made. And this evening, Lord, as we gather, we do so giving thanks for the way that your creation reveals who you are to us. Lord, we pray that as we gather this evening and we reflect on your scriptures, that you'd be honored by our time together. We ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Take it away.
All right. So at the men's retreat last week, I was having a conversation with Jeff Stillwell, and he was raising a question about what set of views are allowable in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, of which we're a congregation, in regard to eschatology, the end times, and so forth. And I was explaining that we don't actually have a set view, but we do have guardrails. That is to say, there are things that you mustn't go beyond. So, for example, we all of us in the ministry of the PCA profess the bodily return of Christ and the universal judgment and the existence of heaven and hell and so forth. But then other questions, such as, how do you interpret Revelation 20? What is that 1,000 years? And where does that fit in with respect to the return of Christ and so forth? We don't have a unified position on that. Now, what we don't mean by that is that everybody's view is equally as good as everybody else's view. It's not that, but that we rather recognize that the disagreements on that are disagreements within the family. So, for example, Becca Marsh's parents, both parents actually, were vigorous. Her father and then her mother's father were vigorous advocates of the view that's called historic premillennialism. And that's very appropriate to be a vigorous advocate of the view that you hold. And at the same time, recognizing that that does not entitle him to advocate the expulsion of anyone who doesn't hold the same perspective. So in the PCA, we have accepted that when it comes to the issue of creation, that it's the same kind of situation. That is to say, there's a range of views, and at the same time, there are guardrails. Sinclair Ferguson, the theologian, is quoted as having said, "A confession is a place to stand with room to maneuver." That is to say, it gives you some boundaries, but within those boundaries, you have a little bit of leeway. Now, I served on the PCA's study committee on creation. I'm sure that was in punishment for my many sins, and that was activity that we carried out in the late 90s, and we reported to the 2000 General Assembly. And I wrote this, which was really a summary of what I felt at the end of our work as a study committee. The study committee report is readily available, and I wrote all the good parts, and if it isn't a good part, I didn't write it, okay? So, we all agreed to this. We have found a profound unity among ourselves on the issues of vital importance to our Reformed testimony. We believe that the Scriptures, and hence Genesis 1-3, are the inerrant Word of God. We have affirmed that Genesis 1-3 is a coherent account from the hand of Moses. We believe that history, not myth, is the proper category for describing these chapters, and furthermore, that their history is true. In these chapters, we find the record of God's creation of the heavens and the earth ex nihilo, of the special creation of Adam and Eve as actual human beings, the parents of all humanity, hence they are not the products of evolution from lower forms of life. We further find the account of an historical fall that brought all humanity into an estate of sin and misery, and of God's sure promise of a Redeemer. Because the Bible is the word of the Creator and Governor of all that there is, it is right for us to find it speaking authoritatively to matters studied by historical and scientific research. We also believe that acceptance of, say, non-geocentric astronomy is consistent with full submission to biblical authority. We recognize that a naturalistic worldview and true Christian faith are impossible to reconcile, and gladly take our stand with biblical supernaturalism. However, the committee has been unable to come to unanimity over the nature and duration of the creation days. And so that's the bulk of our report on where we are going to have a presentation of the various views that were held on the study committee, presentations made by advocates of those views rather than opponents, which is the way to do it. Now, a few years after us, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church had a study committee with basically the same brief, and their committee report is about the same as ours. And they could have made their lives a whole lot easier if they had just pointed to ours and said what they said. But being the OPs, that's intended to be a poke at my OP friends, but there we are. So, we're not here primarily to talk about the days in Genesis and those sorts of things. We can, if the conversation goes there. And I'm not here primarily to advocate my perspective on that. I'm really wanting to sort of prompt Dr. Ross to tell us about his involvement in these discussions about historical Adam. If anybody wants to know what I think, well, you should buy my books, I guess. But you could save yourself a lot of time. You can go to YouTube and you can watch a conversation. We didn't call it a debate, but a conversation between myself and Al Mohler, the president of the Southern Baptist Seminary, where we had that conversation. It would be February of 2017. So you're welcome to go there, and you can see you can see how I present things and how Al would present things, and I think Al would be closer to Dr. Ross than I would be. But that's neither here nor there.
That's all right. You're closer to me right now. I mean,
yeah.
I'm also a dad and know the jokes.
We discovered that we're both into dad jokes, so you'll have to pardon us. So I have known Dr. Ross for something like 25 years, initially online, and then we met face-to-face just a couple of years ago at a project in Chicago. But in this book here that was published in 2003, I have Dr. Ross in the acknowledgments page, because I think it was when you were a graduate student, you were very helpful with answering some questions for me, which I am very grateful for. So let's talk about you a little bit. You are a paleontologist,
Yes.
And so let's see. Let's get a little bit of your background. So when I was asking you these questions, you were a graduate student at South Dakota School of Mines. Is that correct?
That's correct. I was working on my master's degree in vertebrate paleontology at that time. So I'm looking at not just paleontology, but the backboned animals in particular. Shells, kind of boring. But dinosaurs, much better.
Okay. All right. And of course, South Dakota and Montana, those are places you'd find a fair amount of fossils.
That's why I went there, yes.
That's why.
I come from Rhode Island originally. Our entire state was scraped over by a glacier, and all the interesting geology was dumped somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. So being a kid that wanted to be a paleontologist, I went first to Penn State for basic geology training, and loved my time there, and then went next to the South Dakota School of Mines, as I had met one of the professors on a field trip, and he invited me to apply. Had a terrible time at that school, as it turned out. They tried to throw me out for some of my advocacy outside of the classroom. But the Lord saw me through that and graced me with a chance to meet the woman who would become my wife. So I got a marriage certificate, way better than the diploma, by a lot. Did manage the diploma, and then we boomeranged back to my home state of Rhode Island, where I worked on my PhD in paleontology once again.
So paleontology, what can you tell us what paleontology is and how that relates, say, to geology or archaeology?
Yeah, so paleontology is the study of fossil life forms, ancient life, the Greek word paleos for deep ancient, and then ology, it's a study, right? You know, it's throwing ology at the end of anything and all of a sudden it's science. But paleontology, I usually tell my students when they first come to class, I'm the fossils and rocks guy here on campus. Because as a paleontologist, you can go kind of two directions. You can go, I'm interested in the organisms and they happen to be fossil, and so there's a very biological route in paleontology. And the other route is, I'm interested in fossils which are found in rocks, and I'm interested in the types of questions that are associated with the geological side of paleontology. And so you can be a paleontologist and do both, and you have to learn both along the way, but there tends to be a trend towards, are you interested in functional anatomy and evolutionary relationships and things like that, or are you interested in things like stratigraphy, which specimens are found in which layers of rock. That was the direction I took. Penn State was a geology program. South Dakota was a very geology-heavy paleo program. And then my interest developed more in that direction. So I look at fossils as data points within a geological setting. And a lot of my research is about trying to tease out what is happening, what can we figure out about the diversity, the extinction. That was kind of my PhD work, was looking at the group of animals called mosasaurs, which when Moses parted the Red Sea, they were on either side, and they weren't. But but if you saw Jurassic World, which I sure hope that you did, because it's got Chris Pratt, I mean, why not? Mosasaurs are the big swimming marine reptile that really saves the day at the end of that first movie. And I waited for years, Jack, years to get my mosasaurs up on Jurassic World, and they finally made it in. There was rumors for a couple of decades of when they were going to show up. But those were my guys, they're technically lizards. So dinosaurs are not lizards. Mosasaurs actually are lizards that happen to be gargantuan and huge, and praise God, they're all dead. I can say that with some authority. Praise God, they're all dead. It would make going to the beach, like the movie Jaws, is Finding Nemo. I mean, it's no comparison.
Right. We would be on the menu.
Oh, yes.
Indeed. So you then went to teach at Liberty, but you're not regularly teaching at Liberty now.
That's correct. I taught at Liberty University from 2005 to 2021. In 2015, my wife and I launched a science supply company to make stuff for homeschoolers. We started with rock and mineral and fossil kits because you do what you know. You know, I was teaching out of materials like this, and I wanted some stuff for homeschoolers that I thought would be of good quality, less expensive than the stuff that we were being overcharged for, you know, at the school. And I wanted something that would also include a component of Christian faith, and particularly for me, young earth creationism, because I know there's a lot of folks in conservative Christianity who are reticent to engage with geology because they're concerned about questions of evolution and deep time and things like that, and they get a box of rocks or some fossils, and they're not sure what to believe of what's put in there. And a lot of kids avoid geology because they don't want to be challenged on issues like how old is the earth, or is evolution true? And those are all issues that I had to come full on and face in my undergraduate and graduate program, because I was, in fact, a young earth creationist and known to be a young earth creationist to my professors all the way through. And I want to be able to open up the world of geology and fossils to kids in a way that I think helps them recognize these are things that God has made. Whether you think he made them a long time ago or more recently, these are his handiwork, and the world is his handiwork, and we should enjoy it and recognize the privilege that we have to explore it.
So I remember a number of years ago, we're part of an email discussion group and have been for these 25 years or so, and you shared with the group a poster you made for the Geological Society of America. That sort of laid out, okay, so here's how a young earth creationist views these things. And I mean, that's very admirable, just to come, you know, straight out and say, here's my perspective and here's how I relate to these things. So Dr. Ross is somebody whom I regard very highly.
Thank you. I think actually I've got something like that that I can show the folks here just briefly as an example of how a young Earth creationist views something like the geological column, and I'll zoom in on this so that it's a little easier to see. Obviously something that I've been thinking about for some time, and wanted to be able to communicate to folks that as a young Earth creationist, there's been lots of different perspectives on the geological record within creationism over the years, from the days of Whitcomb and Morris to what was going on in the 90s, or what was going back all the way in the 1920s with George McCready Price, an early flood geology person. So the layers that we have in geology, we've probably heard some of these before. That word Jurassic there. If you haven't heard this, you're not an American. Probably doesn't have a pulse either. But there's a lot of other names on here that are very unfamiliar. We have words like Ordovician and Silurian. Well, actually, Ordovician would be very familiar to you, even if you don't know it, because most of the rocks in this area of the country are Ordovician and Mississippian. All these limestones that are in your yard and are making road cuts and things like that are primarily Mississippian. They're called that because they have a characteristic set of fossils that are similar to each other and somewhat dissimilar from other rock layers below or above them. All of these names in this geological column, going from the Cambrian, the first time we see many complex life forms, all the way up to basically the surface gravels and stuff like that that we find in what's called the Holocene, are all characterized and defined on the basis of their fossil content. And this system, which is divided into the Proterozoic and the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. Old words for these at the beginning of geology were the primary, the secondary, and tertiary, in part because they thought that they were primarily formed in creation week. Secondary ones were probably during the flood, and tertiary ones might have been after the flood. If you go back to some of the old English writings and German writings of the 1700s on this. And we've still got that division because there still is a fundamental reality to the column itself. And all of this column was built before Charles Darwin was writing The Origin of Species. The only difference is a couple of things got inserted here because they were distinguished from other stuff inside. But Darwin's concept of evolution was in part an attempt to explain this pattern, not to create the pattern. So something that we occasionally hear is, Charles Darwin kind of invented the geological column and it, or something like that. That's actually not true. He was taught this by the people who invented it. People like Adam Sedgwick, who was an old Earth creationist, a catastrophist geologist, and the very first geology professor in history at Cambridge. And so Darwin was trained by the very first geologists academically that were ever in the world. But Darwin took what he knew and said, I think there's a way to explain this that doesn't involve successive creation, which was the dominant position when he was around.
Right. Good. This is really interesting, and if there's time, maybe we'll come back to some of these things, and also to talk about how you relate your science and your reading of the Bible and so forth. I guess it's my job to watch the clock.
Yes,
so,
thank you.
What I want to focus our attention on is your project that you've been involved in a multiple views book on historical Adam.
Yeah.
I have an interest in that since I was a contributor to an earlier book on 4 views of historical Adam, and now somebody got the idea that there's money to be made in having a second 4 views on the historical Adam.
That was Bill Craig's idea.
Was it Bill Craig?
Yes,
Oh, I see.
because he just wrote a new book,
He did.
and now he wants people to talk about his book, so you make another book where inside that book they talk about your book.
Okay, you're getting some
people have better
inside
business sense than I do.
You are getting some inside baseball here. So was it his idea to have a session at the Evangelical Theological Society where he had people responding to his book?
That I don't know.
Okay.
But
I participated in that a couple of years
wouldn't
ago.
surprise me.
Yeah. Well, very good, very good. Okay, so you have 4 contributors. Can you tell us something about the 4 contributors and summarize their positions, and then I'll ask you some more detail, especially about what your contribution is.
Sure. So yeah, this new book is published by Broadman and Holman, or will be. It's slated to be on shelves in January. excuse me, the four contributors in this are Kenton Sparks, who has left evangelicalism, and he holds to an errancy view of the Bible. The Bible has got plenty of mistakes and is made by a very human set of hands. It still contains God's word, but don't look too close because you're going to end up not liking what you see, is kind of his perspective. And he thinks that the way around this particular challenge of Adam and historicity is to just recognize that the Bible is giving us an account that the people at the time thought was correct, but we now know they're not, and so we have just got to adapt to that and look at Adam as a mythological character or as an individual in literature from whom we can glean an understanding of our fallenness. And so that's on the one end. So kind of on the far left, if you will. I'm on the far right. I'm the right-wing nut job. I'm the young earth creationist that was invited to present a young earth creation perspective on Adam. And then sitting in the middle of those two are William Lane Craig, who has recently published a book in which he makes the argument that the narrative components of Genesis 1 through 11 are what he calls mytho-history, borrowing a term from Thorkild Jacobsen. Not exactly using it the way that Jacobsen did, and he's been criticized for basically borrowing and redefining something. But he thinks,
by me.
Yes, indeed, and yeah, you've got a very solid review of Bill's work. And so Bill is saying the way that we can get around this is if we've got basically mythological stories that are scaffolded onto the genealogies, which he believes are trying to give us a historical component here. But Craig is committed to a historical Adam, but he's going to place Adam far deeper in history than most anybody else in Christianity has. He's going to put Adam 750,000 years ago as a member of a species called Homo heidelbergensis, and I'll just bring up a picture of that so that you have it. If I've got something from Craig on that, I think I do. There we go. This is a Smithsonian Museum mock-up of Homo heidelbergensis. He chooses a different one for the cover of his book. Homo heidelbergensis, he believes, is the ancestor between us, Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals. And Craig believes that we need to go back down this far because he believes that there is compelling evidence that Neanderthals were human, and that they display all the sorts of cultural capabilities that we do. And if we are to call ourselves human in the fossil record and see what we do as humans, and we see the same thing in the Neanderthals, then we have no justification in saying they're not human and we are, which is a strong departure from many old Earth creationists of the past who have said that only Homo sapiens, or only certain members of Homo sapiens even, are made in the image of God, and the Neanderthals are just a humanoid sort of creature that does not have a soul. And Craig says, no, that's not the case. So if we're human and they're human, we must find Adam in their common root. And so he pegs that about 750,000 years ago. And then the other participant is Andrew Loke, and he's a philosopher, and he has taken the same position of Dr. Joshua Swamidass, who lives here in St. Louis, is a professor at WashU, and their perspective is that Adam could be a genealogical ancestor to all of us, but not the person from whom all humanity over all of time has originated. That sounds counterintuitive. So they would say that God providentially evolved the Homo sapiens population, and at some point in time created Adam in the midst of that population, and that Adam's ancestry then continues on and intermingles with the rest of humanity over time until such a point as we are all in Adam somehow. We can all trace ourselves back to Adam. You and I share Adam as a great-great-great-great-grandparent with people on the other side of the world eventually. And so this has been called the genealogical Adam and Eve hypothesis. And Andrew Loke and Josh Swamidass have some different nuances in how they read the text. Josh splits Genesis 1 and 2 apart as two different stories altogether. Andrew Loke is more of your and I opinion that Genesis 1 and 2 should not be separated as distinct creative events. But Andrew then has to get around, what do you do with the other people? He says they're not even human. Josh says the other people that were created were human, they're just not the people of interest in God's salvific message over time, that he's eventually going to get to that. So Andrew goes far enough to the point where he says it doesn't matter that they show evidence of cultural components, religiosity, or whatever. They're not human unless they come from Adam.
And so how far back does he find? I'm curious about this because I've had some interactions with Dr. Swamidas. So how far back does Andrew put Adam and Eve?
Yeah, so in Josh's view, he wants to have Adam as fairly recent. He says we can have Adam 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Andrew Loke is more comfortable with Adam being 50 to 100,000 years ago, more in keeping with, say, reasons to believe Hugh Ross's position. So he kind of pulls more from the old Earth creation, the historic old Earth creation perspective, but is saying we can't avoid the evolutionary issue. And so we're going to have a genealogical Adam. And I think, even though I don't like these views very much, to be honest, I think they are deeply troubling when you've got parallel streams of humans, some of whom are made in the image of God, and some of whom are not, or some are able to be saved through the work of Jesus, and others are outside of that. I think we run into some deep theological problems. Nonetheless, the continued drumbeat of argument that evolution requires the human population to always have been large in the past and never come down to 2 people, I think is going to put increasing pressure on a lot of Christians to adopt something like a genealogical Adam if they don't want to go full bore Adam is mythological. So I think that's one of the reasons why we've got this new book. It's been 10 or 11 years since yours, and the ground is actually shifting pretty quickly here. Things are popping up. We've got these genealogical views, William Lane Craig's views. Reasons to Believe has got their views still out there. Young Earth creationists just keep hanging around and don't go away. And so what do you do with this? But it's interesting because in yours, you had a typical young Earth creation view, a fairly conventional old Earth view, a mythological view, and Walton's kind of, it's not talking about any of this, so, what have you. And in this, you've got a young Earth creation view and 3 different flavors of theistic evolution. Mm-hmm. And that classic old Earth position, which has been around since, at least the late 1700s, doesn't have a position in here. And I kind of wonder if that's a harbinger of some of the difficulties that position might be having in the future, and how it's going to have to pivot and figure out how to address these issues.
Right. So, and that's part of what motivated Bill Craig was how far back do you have to get in order to be able to have a population of just 2? Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
That was one of his concerns, and he was building on some work by Richard Buggs, who's a British geneticist, plant geneticist, who was arguing that if you've got older than 500,000 years, you can make the number 2 work. Mm-hmm. They're operating in the context, and you can see this in a number of evolutionary writings where they're saying that in order for you to have the kind of genetic diversity that's present in the current human population, you need to have a larger number than 2 as the very first of humanity.
Yeah, they would say typically the population of humanity never dipped below 10,000 or something like that, just as a round number. And that's caused a lot of challenge. That's been one of those genetic arguments that's come about fairly recently. It was one of the hinge points for Veneman McKnight's book on Adam, and trying to say, listen, evangelicals, you're going to have to figure out a way to deal with Adam as not what you thought he was. Right. And to be fair to Josh and to Bill Craig, their responses are an attempt to bring a real, actual Adam back into this and say, no, evolution doesn't require us to abandon Adam. Craig says if we go back far enough, basically we get out of the view of the science, and I can say to, and you can't say I'm wrong. And Josh Swamidas does exactly the same thing, but in a different sort of way. He says that because genetics allows us to see very close in our immediate relations, and genetics allows us to see deep in our connection with apes, presumably, if evolution is true, but there's a blind spot in between of what are called genetic ghosts and genealogical ghosts, people that we know exist, but we have no evidence for them because they haven't given us any of their DNA, because the further back you go, the DNA from those parents and grandparents and great-grandparents is diluted. And so Josh seeks, and likewise Andrew Loke in the book, is able to say, we could have Adam in this blind spot, and science could never tell you that he can't be there. And what I find about both of those apologetics is that they're extraordinarily defensive. They are putting Adam in a place where science can't say yay or nay and thinking this protects us from the dangers of falsification. And for Craig, it's put it far back enough and science can't tell you. For Josh and Andrew, put it in this little window, actually an alcove, this little cubby, and Adam can be there. But it's not a positive apologetic. It's not, I have evidence for this position. It's rather, it's unfalsifiable, so I can do it, and I can believe it, and if I can believe it, then it's okay. And that's, theologically, that's never quite the right way to go. You don't say, just because I can believe something, it's okay to believe. No, we can believe all kinds of bad things. And then stepping into the mix of this is me saying, actually, guys, a lot of this is wrong in some way, or there's a different way to look at both, to look at the scientific issue. Now, I'm not a geneticist, and I'm not competent to make a concerted effort against this argument about 10,000 human beings. But my experience in paleontology allows me to approach the human fossil record, which I never had any interest in. I'm more of an introvert, and I don't like people.
He's my kind of person here, so yeah.
We could get along really well just reading our own books in the room together. It's very, this is nice. Obviously, that must ring pretty true. That's a good bit of laughter out there. And my interest in paleontology has always been in dinosaurs and things with big teeth and some cool mammals and even some shelly things that I think are pretty awesome. Quite honestly, a lot of stuff is cool. But the human record has always been contentious and filled with lots of big egos and people who always thought they found the best thing. And plus the evidence is kind of scrappy and there wasn't much. And I just had no interest in that until another person we have that we know, Hans Maduemi, who teaches at Covenant College in Georgia, he asked me to review Josh's book as part of a group, myself, Dick Averbeck, and a couple others to kind of have a dialogue about the book. And I was one of the more critical ones on that. And I think that there's a different way of going about and looking at the data, but it does require that I'm going to have to kick against the pricks, so to speak, of evolution and the evidence for a deep age to the Earth. But those are areas where I have been trained in. I understand the arguments that are there. I've had to operate as an old Earth evolutionary paleontologist for many, many years. It was the only way to do any work. And even though I had different opinions, I had to do the work the way they wanted in order to continue on with my degrees. So I come in and say, I think there's a different way of understanding this. And the way that I look at the hominin fossil record is very different from various old Earth perspectives within Christianity, old Earth creation, theistic evolution, what have you. Most of the folks who've been looking for Adam in the fossil record have been looking for Adam amongst Homo sapiens, because we are human, and Adam is a human, and we know what that is. And we've seen the Sistine Chapel. He's a white guy. So is God. Sort of, right? But nonetheless, despite our tendency to illustrate things the way that we look today, we've never kind of considered that Adam might be something different. And I'm more of the opinion, actually my opinion is much more similar to Bill Craig's. He's got Homo heidelbergensis here. I actually think that Craig doesn't go far back enough in terms of which hominid to pick, even though I'm disagreeing with him on the time frame. For a young Earth creationist, the hominid fossil record is post-flood. And I had that up there on the top there. Like the early geologists who divided the rocks into the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary of what was made during creation week, what was made during the flood, and what was made after the flood, modern young Earth creationists likewise look at the geological record in the same fashion. There are some rocks that I believe God spoke into existence that are still with us that we can see. There are a majority of rocks that have fossils in them. All the stuff that I was studying, I think, was produced during the flood. And then at some point, the flood ends, and there's probably some fossils that are made after that. I think a considerable amount. Other people think a lot less. But all young Earth creationists are of the opinion that the human fossil record, which is at the very top of all of this, in the most superficial deposits that are isolated and dislocated from one another. They're not part of gargantuan slabs of rock that cover half of North America or anything like that. This reflects the post-flood recolonization of people after the ark has landed. And so while most of my friends and colleagues on the old Earth and evolutionary side are looking for Adam amongst Homo sapiens or maybe even deeper, I think that they're actually looking upon the evidence and the fossil record of Noah's family and the post-flood recolonization. I don't think we can get to Adam specifically, but I think we can get to something like what Noah might be like. And one of the ways that I think we can do this, and one of the ways that I present this in the book, is we can take a look at the cultural artifacts that they produce. We can take a look also at their skeletons and see, can we distinguish modern humans from non-humans using different sorts of scientific approaches? And if we can do that, are there other things that cluster in with us as humans and other things that cluster in with the decidedly non-human things like chimpanzees and gorillas? And I'll give you an example of one of these. I'll kind of walk you through what hopefully a data-driven young Earth creationist perspective is. As I shared with the Sunday school group here today, I'm not interested in proving evolution wrong. That doesn't motivate me, that doesn't interest me, because my interest is in discovering what is right rather than showing what is wrong to be wrong. And within young Earth creationism, we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to show people that they're wrong about things. An inordinate amount of time. And you know that just as well. We're a fractious group, and creation evolution issues can get very heated and very passionate. And theistic evolutionists can do it, and old Earth creationists can do it. We all can fight badly with one another. And it's one of the reasons I appreciate so much the opportunity to be here and talk about these things and not be like, yeah, well, let me show you my evidence, and you're going to show me your evidence. The evidence is God's. It's not mine. It's not yours. It's His world. We get the chance to take a shovel and dig into it. That's amazing. The Proverbs say that it's the glory of the Lord to conceal a matter, and it's the glory of the kings to search it out. We are kings and queens over creation. We are made in His image. We were intended to do this sort of stuff. And so if I am going to try to understand the fossil record itself with, all of these different species, I think I had a little animation supposed to happen on that, but I don't know if it's going to work. But all of these different species, my goodness, what is that? There we go. Okay, I'm going the wrong way. We've got this system that says here are all these different groups. Here's where they appear over the course of several, in this case, 5.5 million years worth of history. If I'm a young Earth creationist, I can't just point and say that's wrong, because eventually somebody's going to say, well, what's right? And I better have a decent answer for that, or at least a guiding set of principles through which I can do that. And for the evolutionists, what they do is they put these on trees, right? Ever since Darwin, his very first sketch in his notebook was this little tree, and above it he scrawled, "I think." And he did this sometime in around 1842. It was his first musings about life as connected as a tree. And evolutionists take a set of data, they take these different organisms, and they take physical measurements and observations about their skeletons, and they run them into a big, huge data matrix. Oh, sorry, wrong way here. Let me get this right. And this is what one of these things looks like for mosasaurs. So the mosasaurs, these are the things that I studied, big swimming marine lizards. This is a data set. Okay, you don't read it, you don't try, it's horrible. But what you've got on one side over here, let's see, is my mouse showing up? No, it's not, but I think I have, good, laser pointer.
Over there on the far left.
Okay, yeah, on the far left we have the names of the different critters. There's 41 of them. And then you got this big block full of ones and zeros and question marks and things like that. These are the different physical character states that they might have. So we might look and say, do you have, where do the teeth fit on this end bone of your snout? Are they right up to the front, or is there a protuberance of bone before you get to the teeth? How many teeth do you have in your jaw? Do the bones around the nasal opening, are they made up of these bones or these bones? And all these things get coded as ones and zeros, because we're going to take this and put it into a computer and tell the computer, spit out a tree. And sometimes we have not much data. The one up at the top has got a lot of question marks because it's a very incomplete fossil. So we put question marks there so they don't goof up the program. Other times we have very complete fossils, and they have lots of 1s and 0s and 2s on this. And that will generate trees. But there's another way to approach these data sets, because I'm not going to throw away good data. My evolutionary colleagues are smart, and they're observant, and many of them are careful. They're good scientists. They're trying to do good work. They're committed to an evolutionary relationship amongst all of the life forms because they think evolution is correct, and so they put it into a program that makes trees because that's the way they think life moves over time. But as a young Earth creationist, I think that trees are separated from one another, that God didn't make a singular tree of life, but rather he made an orchard with lots of different kinds of animals that have distinctions from one another. One way that we can represent these is by taking those same data sets and plotting them out on different types of graphs that don't confine us to a tree system. This one that has the little squares here, this just runs the data through a similarity index. It looks at those question marks and those numbers, and it says, are you very, very similar to this other thing, or are you very different to this other thing? And if it's very similar, we get a black box. If it's very different, we get an open circle. And then we see that there's kind of these 5 groups. And the group on the very bottom, this would be Australopithecus afarensis and its kin, the Lucy fossil, and other things a lot like it, other species. The middle has us as Homo sapiens, along with some other species like Neanderthals and Homo erectus. And we seem to be statistically similar to one another. Then there's this other group that's very different from everything else, and that's another group of apes called Paranthropus. And there's 3 species in there, and they're really different from us, and they're pretty different from the other ones. The set of balls here that are floating, think of this like you're looking into the corner of a room. So there's our floor and there's our walls, and here we've got balls floating in midair, and these are showing us that there's some clustering as well. It's a different method than the similarity index, but it actually gave us the same clusters. You go, okay, 2 different ways of looking at the data, we get the same kinds of clusters. There might be something real about this. Now this, if I say maybe we have a biblical kind, maybe we have a kind in Australopithecus lucy and her kin, that's a different hypothesis than my evolutionary colleagues, but it is still just a hypothesis. When you see an evolutionary diagram that looks like this, that is not a conclusion. That is a hypothesis. And the good scientists who do this understand that. They know this is a hypothesis of relationship because for them, any new fossil can change aspects of this. It might shift the members of the tree around. New data can test hypotheses. In the same way, young Earth creationists are thinking about this and saying, is there a way that we can try to identify groups of organisms that are similar? And this would indicate and hypothesize that we Homo sapiens are statistically very similar to and cluster with Neanderthals. And so this is one of the reasons why I agree with Bill Craig. How would we test this? Well, we would test this by then looking at other evidences, like the archaeological record. And when we find that Neanderthals had controlled use of fire, so well controlled use of fire that they actually made glues out of pine resin in a sealed container devoid of oxygen that had to be worked on at a certain temperature in order to get the consistency they wanted because they were gluing their spearheads onto the stick while the Homo sapiens were wrapping them with cords. Both work. Both are smart. We also find that Neanderthals were able to take down massive prey. Just a few months ago, there was a big paper that talked about a Neanderthal butchery site where they had taken down a giant mastodon that was about 20 to 30% bigger than an African bull elephant. Huge. Enough meat to feed a clan of 100 for 3 weeks. And they probably processed it over the course of 5 days with 20 people working on this. And they know that they were working on it all over the place because there were nick marks from their stone tools on the insides of the rib of the mastodon. So guys were crawling inside that cavity. They had hollowed that out, and they were working it. And if you're going to harvest that much meat, it's going to rot real fast unless you do something like smoke it.
That was going to be my question. How did they keep it from going off?
Since they have controlled use of fire and seem to be very skilled with it, they're probably smoking their meat. And that's going to make it able to last for a good long time. Does that sound like things that people do? Sure does to me. We know that Neanderthals buried their dead. We've got evidences of graves in caves in Iraq and in France. Shanidar Cave in Iraq, one of the earliest Neanderthals ever found, La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France. We now know that we can see the difference between the dirt inside the cave that was excavated out, the body was placed, and then the dirt was infilled. We can see how the dirt was disturbed for the dig. And you go, burying your dead? That's not something chimpanzees do. That's not something that great apes do. This is something that is a human behavior. We know that they had clothing. We know that they even had some form of artwork. They used red ochre, a red rusty material, to put pigments on things. So seems like Neanderthals are probably human. And so while Craig will look at that and adopting the conventional age of the earth, he'll then draw the line back and try and say whatever the ancestor of them and us was, that could be Adam. I broaden out the field and say what else out there looks like it could be human. And one of them that I would look at would be Homo erectus. And Homo erectus is somewhat different from us. Its cranial capacity, the brain size for Homo erectus, is rather smaller than us on average. This is the skeleton of what's called Narikatomi boy, also called Turkana boy. He was found on the shore of Lake Turkana in Africa, and probably somewhere around 15 years old. Would have been almost as tall as you and I if he had been able to grow to full height, probably somewhere around 5'8", 5'10". So we're not talking about somebody who's small and short and stooped over. This is a skeleton that from the neck down looks remarkably similar to you and I. But in the skull and the face protrudes a little bit more. It has a very thick brow ridge, and it has a smaller cranial capacity that's typically a little outside of our normal range, but not entirely. But one of the things that we see about Homo erectus that's really interesting, they made a lot of stone tools, and they made very consistent stone tools. These ones over here are called Acheulean tools, and the Acheulean hand axe. So this is something that was gripped on the round end and the front end. This thing was the Swiss Army knife. It was used for everything. For throwing as a weapon, because you could actually throw it in the air and it would often come point down. There's a neat study that was done in the 90s by, I think, a Michigan State University anthropologist who had the track team throw these things like discuses. And they would fly like a UFO, and then they would turn end over end and then pit down. And you go, maybe that's one way you take down a mastodon. Pretty smart. Stay far away and throw things.
Okay.
But they also use them for all sorts of tools for cutting and carving things and chopping and whatnot. And we see this, what's called a tool industry in anthropology. This tool industry is all over the place. All the red areas are places where we know Homo erectus was, because either we've got the skeletons or we've got these tools. And one place that I want to point out is this arrow right over here. This is pointing to the island of Socotra, which is off the Horn of Africa, and it's a territory of Yemen from the Arabian Peninsula. It's about 150 miles off of Yemen, and probably a good 100 miles from the Horn of Africa, with only two little islands in between. And there, a group of Russian scientists went there because nobody wants to go to Yemen. It's just kind of dangerous. But the Russians got there, and they went out to Socotra, and they found gobs of these Acheulean tools. There's no way to get to Socotra unless you build a boat. You don't accidentally find yourself out there, and if you do, it's only one of you, and you're not going to make a billion hand axes unless you've gone completely off your rocker, right? So there must have been a colony of Homo erectus out over here. We don't have any skeletons of them, so it's an inference based on the tools, but Neanderthals tended to use different tools. It seems like they've developed some other kind of industry. And again, trying to put this in the context of a post-flood world, I think that what we've got is either before or after Babel, if Babel is the dispersal of all humans everywhere, or if Babel is representing a dispersal of a particular culture. Those are two options that have been kind of thrown about. But in any case, I think in the post-flood world, what you have is society was destroyed and broken. The flood wrecked whatever society was before the flood. Babel shattered the society there, and people are trying to figure out how to live in the world in new societies where they have lost communication, lost ability, and they have to rebuild. And what do? Well, if you watch the TV show Survivor, You're pretty primitive at the beginning. You got nothing but your bandana, right? And a bunch of people's shoes that you stole because you were that guy. You stole everything. One of my favorite guys to watch. He was wicked. But you have to figure out, where is everything? I don't know where the resources are because this is a new world. I've got to work with stone because I don't know where anything else better happens to be, and this is just going to have to work. And we start off with simple tools because we have to make stuff, and over time we figure out how to refine those tools, and then people start figuring out little better ways to do things. And I think this is happening in a much shorter context of time in the post-flood world than what my conventional colleagues do. But I think this is a way for young Earth creationists to approach the actual data, not just to say that the evolutionists are wrong, but how is it that I, as a young Earth creationist, can approach the data, interpret it for what it is, and not hide away and not say, oh, that's a fake, that's a fraud, they don't know that. No, they actually know a lot. We need a little epistemic humility about what we do know, what other people can know. And sometimes they don't know as much as they say they do, but there's a lot that they do. And there seems to be a lot of things that Homo erectus does that look like human. We don't have any grave sites for them, but we do have this curious thing of, it seems like they were migrating all over the world and even being able to get themselves into boats. We know the Neanderthals used boats. They're found now all across the Aegean Sea. They were found on the island of Crete. And we have other organisms that are found in places like Indonesia and up over here in the northern Philippines that also had to get there by boat, and either their ancestors were Homo erectus or they, as Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis, they had to get on there. So somebody had to get there by boat, and there's no way to do it otherwise.
Well, this is fascinating, and I'm filled with loads of questions, and I'm also watching the clock.
Thank you.
So that's my responsibility to you all and also to Dr. Ross. If I might, let's come back to how this all relates to Adam. Adam and Eve. Let's make sure we honor our father and our mother here.
Yes.
Now in the project, and you've mentioned this, you have a basically critical evangelical type as the only Bible scholar in this project.
He's the only actual theologian in the group.
Right. And so what? But what do you think, from your perspective, is at stake in this discussion?
There's a lot, I think, that's at stake for this. And I think both you and I recognize that. We're in agreement that Adam, as our first parent, as you read from the statement that you were on that team to produce, we recognize Adam as the first human being because, if Adam was only talked about in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, maybe you could kind of get around some issues. But the integration of Adam into Christian theology in a very deep way means that we have some room to maneuver, but maybe not so much. When we consider the book of Romans in particular, because there we see more than anywhere else such a deep connection of theology as Paul weaves together an understanding of who we are and who Christ is in all of this. There we go. Pulling this up, this is a chart that I made of Romans chapter 5 to get us to see how frequently Paul talks about this. I talking with my wife, she was like, yeah, sometimes I read Romans 5 and it's just like, come on, Paul, you said that already. Like, this is very repetitious. But when I broke it down like this and we looked at it and went, wow, yes, it's repetitious, but there's an important point for this, because the setup was, in the early part of Romans, like, creation is testimony to God. We all have the knowledge that God exists, but we all avoid that reality anyway, because there's sin in us. There's sin in everybody. It's all over the place. There's sin in all the Gentiles. Good heavens, it's crazy. And then, well, there's sin in all the Jews too. And Paul's like, and yeah, we're loaded with this stuff. And then he brings us to Abraham, because Abraham is not a Jew, right? He is the father of the Jews. And he brings us back because he's talking to the Romans, which is a group of Gentile and Jewish believers. And he brings them back to Abraham to say this person can be a singular focus for our faith and our faith in the grace of God. And he builds that then into Adam, because he's trying to get us back to understand, where is the problem of sin coming from? So with My apologies to the grammarians. From whence is our problem of sin? He goes back to Abraham, who's a model of faith, but Abraham doesn't solve the problem of sin. He goes back to Adam to show us where the problem of sin started with, so that we can now know that all the Gentiles and all the Jews have a common root for that problem. And Jesus, as a descendant of Adam and a descendant through Abraham, and he doesn't go to a Davidic line and all of that here, but contrasts the one act of righteousness that Jesus commits that overcomes the one act of transgression and sin that Adam started. But it's better than that, because it's not only because of the one problem we have the one solution, and the one sin we have the one thing. Jesus' solution is so big, it overcomes Adam's sin and every sin afterwards. It is so superlative in every way. Adam put us on a bad track, but Jesus could beat anything. It doesn't matter how much sin is out there. And it all stems from a historical event. You can't get around the historicity of Adam in Genesis chapter 5, because you also can't get around the historicity of Abraham in Romans chapter 4. The historicity of Abraham is integral to Paul's argument that we have a person that we can look to as a model of faith in God who was not yet a Jew. Before the circumcision, he had faith. The circumcision is now the evidence, and so we can look to that. And now we have to look for the source. And if we continue reading on through Romans, this is where a little of my younger perspective comes back on this. We see, I think, in Romans 8, a key to understand that the fall that Adam initiates, and Eve initiates, because we've got to be fair to both, but to Adam it is counted as sin. But when we look in Romans chapter 8, we see that all creation is groaning because it was subjected to futility, to frustration, by he who subjected it. And if I look back in the canon, where can I see a place where God subjected creation to futility? Well, it says that all of creation is groaning and travailing as if it's in the pains of childbirth. I have a clear allusion to Genesis chapter 3, because what is the punishment for Eve but pain, increased pain in childbirth? So Paul is making a strong allusion, I think, that's bringing us back to Genesis 3. So we've been told where the source of our sin comes from. It comes from an initial act of sin, but it's also one that we're all culpable of on our own. But it has a source, it has an origination, and it has cosmic effects, not only for us as humans, but the entire creation is wrapped up in our sin, because we were the vice regents. We were the ones who were to have dominion over it, and we failed. And because of that, all of creation is now groaning and travailing, but it's doing so in hope for the redemption of our bodies and the coming of the Son of God, who will bring all things to glory. And so Adam's historicity is integral to Paul's gospel. And we can see hints of that in other places. We can see it very clearly in 1 Corinthians. We can see it in hints in Acts 17, where he's at the Areopagus, and he's talking to pagan Greeks, and he doesn't mention Adam's name, but from one man came every nation of men, and God appointed the times and places where they would live. That one man is Adam. This is the consistent component of Paul's gospel, of starting where does sin begin. And we see it in Romans most clearly because, of course, he hadn't gotten to Rome. He hadn't presented his gospel in Rome. Others had, and he was trying to say, this is what it is. But we see it in echoes in Luke, which is strongly influenced by Pauline theology, and we see that Adam is kind of a silent organizing principle. Jesus' genealogy goes all the way back to Adam in Luke. And right after that, we get Jesus leaves and is tempted by Satan. Right after Adam, we have a temptation by Satan. But the last Adam defeats that temptation. He vanquishes Satan and causes him to flee from him from that point on. That Adam can solve the problem of sin in the world. And I think we all look to that. We all look to that in hope and in faith. And that's why you and I both look to Adam as an individual to make sense of the Christian story. We have to, Philip Ryken said it very nicely, actually, in this book, that Adam and his historicity, it's important because these passages of Genesis 1 and 2 and 3, they explain what happens because they told us what happened. So,
Good. Well, thank you very much. I mean, that's
Thank you.
very helpful. And one of the things that I've been keen to do is to answer the objection that there's very little in the pages of the Hebrew Bible made of Adam and his fall, and that it's all, and then laying all the trouble at the feet of the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
And so I've written a few things showing that this story that you've just recited is actually embedded in the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, not necessarily explicitly, but it's there as an assumption. And we sometimes summarize the story of the Bible as creation, fall, redemption, leading up to consummation. That is sort of the skeleton on which the biblical passages are all attached. The biblical passages are the muscles for that skeleton. My adventures or misadventures and discussions of Adam started in 2009. I was asked to give a paper at a meeting of the American Scientific Affiliation, which is Christians in the sciences. And I was asked to make the case for historical Adam over against two guys from Calvin College who were going to make the case for no historical Adam. And in the question time, one of the fellows said, one of the audience said, when Collins speaks, I hear that story, creation, fall, redemption, consummation. When I hear you speak, pointing to one of the fellows from Calvin, I hear something else. Am I hearing you right? And the guy from Calvin was very honest. He said, I want to tell a different story. And so the notion of historical Adam is embedded in the story because, that's where you get our notion of humans as a unified family. It's where you get the notion of humans as a special creation of God and not a merely natural product. And it's where you get the notion of our shared dignity and damage. And that's something that unifies the entirety of humankind. And so that the way it turns out is that based on the best studies in literary readings of the Hebrew Bible, Paul aces the test on that.
A Sternbergian
He's a Sternbergian reader,
as I've read.
Yeah, that's the way I've come to put it. But in any case, I hope you can appreciate, first of all, the importance of the subject, and then secondly, just the engaging way in which Dr. Ross has presented this, and the interest in. I mean, he's careful, he's thorough, he tries to show respect to the data. And I am very grateful for the time together.
Well, thank you very much. Wonderful.
Thank you both for being with us this evening. And I do want to make sure you note that not only this morning we have Dr. Ross and this evening, but he will also be here tomorrow night in the Commons right over here at 7 o'clock and is going to do another presentation. I'm forgetting the name. Tell me the name.
The name is Mostly Dry Bones.
Mostly Dry Bones.
Mostly Dry Bones.
And he's all about bones.
Yes.
He's the guy to address
Love
that.
him.
So I encourage you to come back tomorrow night in the Commons and join us for that. Let me close this with a word of prayer and then I'll dismiss us. Lord, how grateful we are for the story which you have laid out clearly in the Scriptures, that creation, fall, redemption, consummation storyline that we see so richly throughout the Scriptures, and how grateful we are for the last Adam who came and who undid the fall of the first Adam and who rescues us from sin and from judgment. We're grateful to stand in the midst of his forgiveness, to stand in the name of the resurrection Christ, and as well to pray in his name. We do so this evening together. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well.